When my niece Annie and her best friend Janine were in their senior year of high school, they decided to embark on a trip from Burbank to Northern California to check out some colleges. Both sets of parents were a little nervous about the girls embarking on this journey alone without them, but the girls assured them, "We will be just fine." It was early evening, and Annie pulled over to fill the tank with gasoline. Annie asked Janine if she would drive the next leg of the trip because Annie was getting a migraine. With that, the two young women swapped places, and they were on their way. Well, it was well past dark when they reached a long and steep and winding portion of the highway. What happens next, no one knows. But something went terribly wrong. Janine veered too far over to the side of the road, and suddenly the girls found themselves at 70 miles per hour being hurled off an 80-foot cliff. Annie and Janine held hands and prayed together as the car flew through the air. Both girls were knocked unconscious upon impact, and the car burst into flames. By the grace of God, two men happened to be on that dark road that night, and they saw the car go over the cliff. Immediately, they pulled over and they ran down the rocks. And when they reached the bottom, they found Janine wandering with a broken arm and so dazed she couldn't speak. Thinking she was the only person in the car, they started to help her climb back up the mountainside. Fortunately, it was very windy, and something caught the eye of one of the men. As he looked closer, he realized he was seeing Annie's long brown hair blowing out the window. The men ran over, and they found Annie barely conscious and completely pinned under the dashboard. Her femur had broken so badly that it had lodged itself in the dashboard, pinning her in. Surrounded by flames, the men found superhuman strength, and one lifted the dashboard while the other one pulled her out to safety through the window. 30 seconds later, the entire vehicle exploded. Annie was airlifted to a hospital in Modesto, and while in the hospital, the police came to make a report. Annie asked for the names of the two men who rescued her that night so she could thank them. But the police said they were known only as Good Samaritans because they left the scene after they rescued her, but didn't stay for the police to show up. To this day, Annie does not know who pulled her from that car that night. It was a long and difficult recovery, but today Annie is 33, and she is doing great, and she is a zoologist that is in charge of the elephants and rhinos at the Cheyenne Mountain Zoo. So I ask, on that dark and scary night, who was Annie's neighbor? Was it her best friend who she had known for a long time, or was it the two men whose faces she only vaguely remembers? If you think about it, in today's world, the word neighbor has taken on a whole drastically different meaning as culture has changed. We have moved from living in community to cocooning, from neighbor helping neighbor to I can do it myself. Casual conversations over the fence or a beverage has moved to text messaging. My point will be shown. How many of you actually know every single neighbor on your street? According to a recent poll, only 31% of Americans can claim that they know even one of their neighbors. And what's even sadder is that most don't want to know who their neighbors are. All of this begs the same question that the lawyer tested Jesus with so long ago. Who is my neighbor? And if I'm to love my neighbor as myself, what does that look like? I'm sure each of us has an idea in our own mind of who our neighbor might be, but I believe that if we do as we did last week, where we go back in time and look at this parable, this story Jesus is telling, through the eyes of a first century Jew, we might just be challenged by the story in a whole new way. In antiquity, people lived in community not only for companionship and survival, but also for protection from the enemy. The communities were small, usually about 200, and they were all made up of people who thought the same, who dressed the same, who believed the same, and who worshiped the same, because after all, they did everything together. Therefore, when the lawyer hears Jesus start this simple story about who your neighbor is, he's thinking it's about people who are like-minded as he is. And what Jesus is going to do is challenge all who hear by making them think the unthinkable and imagine the impossible. So the parable proper starts with a man heading down the road from Jerusalem to Jericho. Now the road was well known in ancient times and it was well traveled, but it has about a 600-foot drop-off and in between all of its twists and turns. Because of its rocky nature, the road was known for extreme violence. And per its reputation, the man is attacked by robbers. He is beaten, he is stripped, and he is left almost half dead in a ditch. Now at this point, if we are a good first century Jew, we will have immediately identified with the man in the ditch, and we would be laying there saying, "Here I am dying. Who is going to rescue me?" And this is where the story begins to turn. In those days, all Jews knew that they were part of one of three categories of Jews. One was either a priest, who was a direct descendant of Moses' brother Aaron, or a Levite, who was a descendant of Aaron, but from Joseph's son Levi, or you were an Israelite, who was one of the descendants of the other brothers. Much like we have Larry, Mo, and or father, son, and we have priest, Levite, Israelite. So here we are, all of us. We're lying almost dead in the ditch, and we see a priest come towards us, and we have hope that we will be saved. But the priest walks on by, and he doesn't just walk on by. The Greek word used for that is antiparalthon, and that means not just step aside, it means he went way around. Well, and then the Levite comes by, and what does he do? He does the very same thing without even looking back. So now all who are listening to this parable for the first time, they're automatically going to believe that the next person that is going to come along will be an Israelite. Because as I said, it's priest, Levite, Israelite. And this is where our parable becomes scandalous. Because it's not an Israelite who shows up next, but it is a Samaritan. And not only does he stop, but he offers mercy and compassion and even takes us into town, gets us to an inn, gets us medical care, which he pays for out of his own pocket. Friends, this is unheard of, because being touched by a Samaritan would have been unthinkable to the Jews of Jesus' day. A Samaritan was someone who was the Jews' enemy. They were a lowlife. They called them half-breeds and worthless and not worthy of a second glance. And they certainly weren't someone you actually wanted to touch you. Samaritans and Jews had been at war with one another since the time of Abraham. And yet, Jesus goes there in this story. He goes there to force those who are listening to understand what love of neighbor really is. He pushes them to think the unthinkable and imagine the impossible, because that is how Jesus sees the people in the world. Therefore, the question for us today is not about us putting ourselves in the role of the Good Samaritan. It's about looking at the story from the flip side, from the side of the victim, and asking ourselves, if we were laying half dead in the middle of the road, is there anyone from any group whom we would rather die than have touch us and then thank them for what they did for us? So let's pretend we're the ones that are trapped in the burning car, and someone comes to rescue us who we might not consider a neighbor as per our own standards. Let's say it's a gang member, or a filthy homeless person, an illegal immigrant, an addict, a political rival, a member of ISIS. Would we want any of these people to touch us, to rescue us from the flames? If we can imagine that, then we can imagine what true love of neighbor really does look like. For if we can imagine that our enemies are also made in the image of God, then we might just also believe, to be able to conceive that the very people we think might kill us under certain circumstances might be the one to save our lives. On December 20th, 1943, an American pilot named Charles Brown was in the flight of his life. For his B-17 bomber had been hit by German fighters. All but 2 of his crew were dead, and the remaining 2 were severely wounded. He had a giant hole in the side of his plane, and all he could do was fly very low and try to get back to safe territory. On the other side is Fritz Stigler, and he was a member of the German Armed Forces and an ace fighter pilot. One more kill, and he would receive the Knight's Cross, Germany's highest award for valor. While having his plane fueled, Fritz noticed off in the distance this low-flying American bomber. A few days earlier, his brother had been shot down and killed by an American plane, and he was going to avenge his brother's death. Fritz jumped into his jet and took off toward the wounded B-17. And as he got closer, he could see that gaping hole in the side and that the gunner was dead. He was going to get his award. He knew what was coming. And he decided that for his brother, he was going to fly up next to the plane and look at the pilot in the eye before he went in for the kill. As he came closer, the 2 pilots locked eyes for just a brief moment. One whose eyes were filled with revenge and anger, and the other whose eyes were filled with terror and pain. It was then that Fritz, who once studied to be a priest, reached in and touched his rosary. Something changed in him, and instead of pushing the trigger, he pulled his hand off the trigger, nodded at Charlie, and became his wingman, escorting him all the way across enemy territory so that Charlie could land safely. When they parted ways, Fritz saluted Charlie. Both men that day learned a lesson about faith over prejudice and who was their neighbor. Both men survived the war, but for nearly 50 years, they were both plagued with extreme nightmares. One day, while holding the Bible that Charlie kept in his upper pocket all through the war, he had been plagued by wondering what happened to Fritz. And so he wrote a letter to a German newsletter for former pilots, detailing the incident and asking if anyone had any information. On January 18th, 1990, Charlie received a letter, and when he opened it, it read, "I always wondered what happened to the B-17. Did she make it or not?" It was signed by Fritz Stigler. These once enemies ended up becoming best friends. Fritz even moved his whole family to Florida so that the two buddies could live out the rest of their lives together, bound by their faith and their love. And the best part was for them, when that happened, their nightmares stopped. They lived as best friends until Fritz's death in 2008. Friends, every single person on this planet is a neighbor to love, because every one of us is created in the image of God. Are we able to imagine that the enemy could, under certain circumstances, be the very one to save our lives? Can we be vulnerable enough to look at our enemy in love? If we can do that, then the parable has worked on us. There is so much pain, so much hatred, so much division in our world right now due to the color of our skin, our religions, our political parties, our identities, our cultural differences, and as individuals and as a family of faith, we need to be the change. We need to be the ones who bring mercy and compassion to everyone else, just as we would want done for us. We need to become the ones that let go of the labels and live every single day of our life in love. For to love God is to love our neighbors, is to love God. Who is your neighbor? Let us pray. Loving God, your Son calls us to love our neighbors as ourselves. And while that seems such simple words, it is so much harder to live into. Open our eyes and our hearts to see the purity of your love and to see one another the way you see us, as everyone created in your image. May we learn what it means to offer love that knows no boundaries. And may we see all of life with compassion and kindness towards all of humanity whom you created in your image. May we love one another as you love us. Amen.